to start things off, Martin, I thought, it would be a lovely recap if you told everybody how you got the name Sorrell.
How did I get it? Well, I didn't get it. It was my father got it in 1924, I think it was. He read a book by Warwick Deeping called Sorrell and Son. In fact, the BBC turned it into a series, it's like an upstairs, downstairs story. It's about a story of a butler or a manservant who devotes his life to his son. It's quite a touching story, and all his resources go to educating his son in a private school and his education and development. My father loved the story so much that he changed the name. There was a fair bit of anti-Semitism at that time, and he had a rather Russian name and thought a name change would be appropriate. So that's where Sorrell comes from.
And now, as you find a name for your company, do you search for a new bookstore?
No, I didn't search for a new bookstore, Anna. That's rather cheeky of you. What I did was just name it. I guess there are 4 generations of Sorrells that have been in the UK. So my grandfather came from Eastern Europe, together with my grandmother from the Ukraine in 1899, not speaking a word of English, so their marriage certificate had their names with crosses, and the 4 witnesses had crosses. And then my father was brought up in the East End of London, had to leave school at 13, despite a music scholarship from the Royal School of Music, and despite being able to quote Shakespeare and the Talmud frequently and at length, but he never had the opportunity. He had to become an income-producing unit. He lavished all his effort and attention, as did my mother, on me, so I was a spoilt only child. I did have a brother who died at birth, so I was the last chance, basically. And then there's my generation, and then there's my kids' generation. I have 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. And so S4 is sort of 4 generations of Sorrells in the UK, at least so far.
Right, so now to the meat. So what is S4 going to be?
I thought that was the meat, Anand. So as far as S4 is concerned, I mean, having had a chance to reflect, albeit a brief chance to reflect, and because I had time to reflect also when I was trying to run WPP, obviously our industry, the advertising and marketing services industry, is in a state of flux. I think that's the best way to put it. There's discussion as to whether that flux is strategic or structural, or whether it's cyclical, and clearly it's a mixture of both. It's an industry which, according to my calculations, or the calculations that we've been developing over 33 years at WPP, it was a $1 trillion industry, about $500 billion in traditional media and traditional communication services, and about 500 billion in the new stuff. Interestingly, Ken Auletta, in his new book Frenemies, which will be out on the street shortly, talks about it being a $2 trillion industry. So I'm grateful to him for doubling it up in size. I'm not sure that that statistic is particularly accurate, but I think the 1 trillion is more like it. But clearly there's significant change, whether that's because of Google and Facebook, whether that's because of Accenture and IBM and Deloitte, or whether it's because of significant change in the way that clients are going about their business. There is structural and there is cyclical change. There is significant flux in the industry, and I think that brings opportunities. So if you look at that $1 trillion, or if you look at that $20 billion that was and is inside WPP, there are parts of it that are growing, and there are parts of it that are either stagnant or declining, and it's a question of identifying those growth opportunities, probably in 2 buckets. I mean, it's, I think, quite interesting, certainly to me personally, that I'm talking to you, Anand, in India, and talking to people in India. And of course, if I look at WPP today and over the last few years, India has been a pivotal economy for WPP. It has a very large market share in that market. It has 14 or 15,000 extremely talented people who I've always thought that if we had, and said when I was in India and outside India, if we had the same quality everywhere in the world, I could have retired a long, long time ago. So it's interesting that India represents the two buckets that I'm referring to. The first bucket being the geographical one, faster growth in terms of GDP, population and potential. India in a few years' time will be the most populous country on the planet, and one with one of the youngest profiles on the planet. And secondly, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, from a technological point of view, India has leapfrogged a lot of the technologies, the desktop technologies and ordinary phones, almost from analog to smartphone in one leap, and represents significant opportunity. And there's been a lot of highly disruptive approaches in India. We're going through one now in distribution with Amazon and Flipkart and Walmart and Alibaba, but we have gone into it or been through it with the disruption caused in 5G, particularly by Jio and Mukesh Ambani's very significant investment in telecommunications and technology. So to me, it's interesting, maybe partly by accident, that I end up talking to you and your audience, because India represents to me opportunities in terms of growth, both economic growth and technological growth. And I think those are the two buckets. And there are then three things that obviously people are very focused on, whether they be clients, media owners, or people in our industry, or indeed share owners or investors. They are technology, data, and content. So those three elements are really key to the growth. And if I look at last year, it strikes me there were two seminal moments for the industry. The first was the abortive attempted takeover of Unilever by Kraft Heinz, which only lasted 48 hours, but was an iconic moment, because basically it said no company, no particularly packaged goods company, was safe. And the second iconic moment was in November, when Rupert Murdoch signaled that he would negotiate a deal in relation to Fox with Disney, although the situation has become much more complicated with the involvement of Comcast. So those two moments seem to me to be the iconic ones last year, which signaled significant disruption. Again, structural and cyclical. We can argue as to how much structural and how much cyclical, but a lot of disruption for clients and for media owners. And those were the two signals, I think, that really laid out the agenda and what will be the agenda for S4 Capital. Not easy to navigate, not easy to do. It's a big hill to climb, but S4 Capital is the first brick in the wall.
Right. Martin, while on this, what is your prognosis in the future of the network, the agency network, and the network agency, both?
Well, I think the network agencies and the holding companies, certainly have a strong future. I have no doubt about that. It's a $1 trillion industry, or according to Ken, a $2 trillion industry. There's a lot of opportunity in an industry that size. But of course, as I saw at WPP, and as I see in the brief time I've been out of WPP, and as I look at what S4 Capital may or may not do, there are very significant opportunities. If you think of that $1 trillion, or indeed the $20 billion at WPP, you see parts of the business that are growing, you see parts of the business that are flat, and you see parts of the business that are declining. When you have a legacy company, any legacy company, it doesn't have to be WPP, it can be Omnicom, it can be Publicis, it can be Dentsu, it can be Havas, it can be IPG, indeed it could be MDC. They all have legacy bits to them, that, of course, given the changes I've just touched on and you've touched on, mean that the business is more challenged than if you start with a clean sheet of paper. So I think starting with a clean sheet of paper is an advantage. It enables you to choose where you're going to go and to choose the areas of activity without being a prisoner of history. And if you do have legacy businesses, they have advantages. They have reputation. They have contact and networks. They have the people of great talent inside them. But maybe the historic structures impose conditions on their operation which make it more difficult. So certainly with a clean sheet of S4 capital and using the cash shell that we announced today with Derriston gives us an opportunity to build afresh, taking into account the changes that are taking place at clients, the new structures that clients want, the new approaches they want, given the new structures and changes that are taking place in media, and then finally the changes that are taking place in industry in terms of production, whether it be robotics or 3D printing or distribution with Amazon and Alibaba and Tencent and others. So looking at all those things, I think it gives us an opportunity to plant our flag where we think, or flags where we think the greatest opportunities are.